When the war began in September 1939, for many ordinary Germans, it felt like a distant, disconnected affair. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg in Poland was reported by the state-controlled press as a swift, righteous, and defensive action against Polish aggression. Life in major cities like Berlin, Munich, or Hamburg was still remarkably normal. It was a carefully managed facade that stood in stark contrast to the food lines and domestic misery of the First World War. This apparent normalcy was a carefully crafted illusion. The Nazi regime had spent 6 years building the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. This was a powerful, seductive idea of a unified, classless, and racially pure society. It was built on the exclusion and later the destruction of those deemed unworthy: Jews, Roma, political opponents, the disabled, and anyone who dared to dissent. For the Aryan majority, life in 1939 was a strange and contradictory mix of order and anxiety. The chronic unemployment of the Weimar Republic was gone. The Strength Through Joy, or Kraft durch Freude program, provided subsidized leisure, concerts, and even holidays. But beneath this state-managed happiness, the fear of the Gestapo, the blockwart, blockwarden, who watched every family, and the immense pressure to conform, was suffocating. Rationing had already begun before the Polish invasion, a clear sign of the regime's total preparation for war. Food and clothing cards, the Reichskleiderkarte, were issued to all citizens. But with the quick, early victories and the propaganda machine in full gear, these seemed like a minor, temporary, and patriotic inconvenience. The nation was being told it was on the verge of a new, glorious 1,000-year era, and for a short, deceptive time, many believed it. The years 1940 and 1941 were the intoxicating high water mark for the German home front. The Blitzkrieg smashed through Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and most shockingly, France. A war that many Germans had feared would be a bloody, years-long stalemate like World War I was, seemingly won in a matter of weeks. The fall of Paris was treated as a national holiday. Propaganda, masterfully orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, went into overdrive. The Wochenschau, the weekly newsreel shown before every film, was a cinematic triumph of lies. It showed endless, thunderous footage of victorious German soldiers marching under the Arc de Triomphe, of Stuka dive bombers, and of grateful, liberated populations. Church bells rang out across the Reich to celebrate. For a brief, intoxicating period, the war seemed to have almost no downside for the average civilian. The rationing system was still in place, but it was now supplemented by a steady, massive stream of plundered goods from occupied Europe. Soldiers on leave returned as conquering heroes, their bags filled with Parisian silks, French wine, real coffee from Holland, and chocolate from Belgium. This was a grotesque prosperity, built directly on the theft and brutality imposed on others. While German civilians enjoyed French cheese and Dutch tobacco, the people of occupied Europe were being systematically starved. And within Germany itself, the noose was tightening. Jewish citizens had been fully segregated, forced from their homes, their property confiscated. They were issued ration cards marked with a large J, which entitled them to near-starvation level supplies, with no access to meat, dairy, or wheat. This period of easy victory created a dangerous, arrogant complacency. The war felt distant, a movie playing out in the newsreels. But in December 1941, with the failure to take Moscow and the first taste of the brutal Russian winter, and compounded by the entry of the United States into the war, the tide began, almost imperceptibly, to turn. The good years were over. The definitive turning point was not a single day, but a single, brutal winter. The disaster at Stalingrad in late 1942 and early 1943 was a catastrophic shock to the German system. An entire army, the invincible Sixth Army, was encircled and annihilated. For the first time, the propaganda machine could not hide the scale of the catastrophe. The casualty lists were too long. The letters from the front had stopped. Goebbels, a master of public manipulation, knew that simple victory propaganda would no longer work. He needed to pivot, to transform the public mood from one of arrogant complacency to one of fanatical, desperate survival. On February 18th, 1943, he staged his most famous and most chilling spectacle at the Berlin Sportpalast. He spoke to a hand-picked hysterical crowd of 14,000 Nazi loyalists, the stage draped in massive swastika banners. His voice rising to a shriek, he laid out the stakes, painting a terrifying picture of Judeo-Bolshevik hordes who would rape and murder the German people. He then posed a series of 10 questions, culminating in the most famous, "Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?" Do you want total war? The crowd roared its assent. Total war. This was a crucial, psychological turning point. The war was no longer about glorious conquest and Lebensraum. It was now pitched as a non-negotiable, apocalyptic battle for the very survival of the German race. Total war meant total mobilization on the home front. Anything not essential to the war effort was eliminated. Women, whom the Nazis had previously pushed into the domestic role of homemakers, were now desperately needed in munitions factories. Non-essential shops, high-end restaurants, theatres, and opera houses were shuttered. The comfortable life of 1940 was a distant memory. The shortages were about to become severe, and the war was no longer over there. It was coming home. To understand daily life in Nazi Germany is to understand that every single aspect of it was saturated with propaganda. It was the air that people breathed, the water they drank. The centerpiece of this control was the Volksempfänger, the people's radio. These cheap, mass-produced radio sets were intentionally designed by the regime with weak receivers. They were nicknamed Goebbels' Schnauzer, or Goebbels' Snout, because they could pick up the official, powerful German stations clearly, but they made it incredibly difficult to listen to foreign broadcasts. Listening to a Feindsender, enemy station, like the BBC, was a Rundfunkverbrechen, radio crime, an act of treason punishable by imprisonment in a concentration camp, or even death. In the cinema, no film could be seen without first sitting through the Wochenschau, the 40-minute weekly newsreel. This was a cinematic masterpiece of propaganda, using dramatic Wagnerian music, manipulative editing, and a thunderous, confident narrator. It showed German victories as glorious and depicted the enemy, especially the Soviets, as subhuman barbarians. In every school, classroom and office, a portrait of Adolf Hitler was mandatory. The Heil Hitler greeting, which had felt awkward to some in the 1930s, was now a compulsory and policed part of every public social interaction. Failure to salute was a sign of disloyalty that could be reported by a neighbor. This system of total control was enforced by the Blockwart, or block warden. This low-level Nazi official, often a nosy and officious neighbor, was responsible for a single apartment building or block. They checked for defeatist talk, ensured flags were flown on holidays, managed the air raid shelter lists, and monitored who visited whom. This created a suffocating atmosphere of intense paranoia, where even a cynical joke told in your own living room could lead to a visit from the Gestapo. As the war turned against Germany, the daily grind became defined by one thing: scarcity. The seemingly efficient rationing system of the early war began to break down under the weight of a two-front war and Allied bombing. Every person was issued a Reichskleiderkarte, or clothing ration card with a point system, and a set of Lebensmittelkarten, food ration cards. This system was a complex, color-coded bureaucracy. Cards were different for children, for normal adults, for heavy workers who received extra protein, and for long night workers. But most sinister were the cards for Jews, which were so meager they were a state-enforced starvation policy before the deportations to the death camps even began. For the average Aryan civilian, the official rations provided a bleak, basic survival, far below what was needed for a healthy life. The hunt for food became the central daily obsession. People would queue for hours at the rumour a shop had received a shipment of potatoes or turnips. The black market, or Schleichhandel, flourished, though it was a dangerous game that could land you in prison. Ersatz, substitute, became the word of the G-Day. Real coffee disappeared completely, replaced by Ersatzkaffee brewed from roasted acorns, barley, or chicory root. Bread, a German staple, was stretched with potato flour, pea flour, and eventually sawdust. Künstler marmalade, artist's jam, was made from turnips and red-dyed artificial sweeteners. Clothing wore out and could not be replaced. The government ran massive scrap drives for old clothes, which were shredded and rewoven into shoddy, a rough, inferior fibre used for new coats. Shoes were sold with wood, as leather and rubber were reserved for the army. Life was a constant, exhausting battle of making do, and the population grew visibly thinner and more weary. Beginning in 1942, but intensifying into a relentless nightmare in 1943, the war came home from the sky. This was the Bombkrieg, the Allied bombing campaign. At first, the RAF raids were sporadic, hitting industrial targets, but they soon evolved into a strategy of area bombing, designed to destroy entire cities, demoralize the population, and break the will to fight. Life in cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin became a nocturnal existence, governed by the wail of the air raid siren. The Luftschutzwart, or air raid warden, would bang on doors, shouting "Licht aus," lights out, to enforce the strict blackout. Residents would grab their emergency cases and shuffle, terrified, into the communal Luftschutzkeller, or air raid shelter. These shelters were often just the reinforced basements of their own apartment buildings, cold, damp, and crowded. People would sit on hard benches in the dark, listening to the muffled thunder of the anti-aircraft flak guns. They heard the sickening, percussive thump of the bombs hitting the streets above. The smell was of damp concrete, sweat, and fear. In July 1943, Operation Gomorrah unleashed a firebombing on Hamburg that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The heat was so intense it created a Feuersturm, firestorm, a vortex of superheated air that reached 800 degrees Celsius. It created hurricane-force winds that sucked people into the flames. The city became a vision of hell, killing over 40,000 civilians in a week. To save the next generation, the regime evacuated children on a massive scale. This was the Kinderlandverschickung, or KLV. Millions of children were sent from the cities to safety in rural areas, but this safety often meant indoctrination in quasi-military, Nazi-run camps, separated from their families for years. This act tore families apart, adding a deep psychological trauma to the physical destruction of their homes. By 1944, the Heimatfront, or Home Front, was no longer a front. It was a collapsing system, being squeezed from all sides. The D-Day landings in June opened the massive Western Front. In the east, the Red Army was on a relentless, vengeful advance, pushing German forces out of the Soviet Union and back toward the Reich's own borders. Propaganda grew more shrill, more desperate, and more disconnected from reality. Goebbels spoke of Vergeltungswaffen, or vengeance weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. He promised these Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, would turn the tide of the war at the last minute. But for the civilians being bombed daily, it was too little, too late. The fabric of society was tearing. With Allied bombers now flying in the daylight, the air raid sirens were a near constant wail. Workers were exhausted, underfed, and living in a state of perpetual fear. The transport system was in chaos. Food rations were cut, and then cut again, to near starvation levels. The most desperate nihilistic measure was the creation of the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, in October 1944. In a final suicidal act, the regime drafted every remaining male between the ages of 16 and 60. These were old men, veterans of the First World War, and teenage boys, armed with old rifles, family shotguns, or single-shot Panzerfausts. They were a pathetic, tragic defense force, given a threadbare uniform, often just an armband, and a few hours of training. They were then sent to face professional, battle-hardened Allied and Soviet armies. Civilians now saw their grandfathers and their 15-year-old sons being marched away as cannon fodder. The illusion of victory was gone, replaced by a grim, hopeless fight for simple survival. The last 4 months of the war, from January to May 1945, were an apocalypse. This was the Götterdämmerung des Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. The Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, was collapsing into rubble, chaos, and a moral void. From the east, the Red Army advanced into Germany, unleashing a wave of brutal retribution for the crimes the Wehrmacht had committed in the Soviet Union. The stories of their rampage, amplified by Goebbels' propaganda, but also rooted in a terrible reality, created a mass panic. Millions of German civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, became refugees in their own land. This was the Great Trek, fleeing west in the bitter cold, pulling their belongings in carts, strafed by planes. In cities like Berlin and Dresden, which was firebombed into oblivion in February, life was no longer lived. It was endured. There was no electricity, no running water, no gas, and no organized food distribution. People lived in the ruins of their homes, in rubble holes, burning their own furniture for a few moments of warmth. The Battle of Berlin, in April 1945, was the end. Soviet artillery shelled the city day and night. The Volkssturm and the last fanatical remnants of the Hitler Youth fought a suicidal house-to-house battle in the streets. Civilians huddled in bunkers and U-Bahn stations, trapped between the advancing Soviets and the roving squads of SS, who were hanging any deserter or defeatist from the nearest lamppost. When the surrender finally came, on May 8th, there was no single, unified feeling. For some, it was a moment of liberation. For the fanatical, it was the end of the world. But for most, there was only a profound, hollow, and absolute exhaustion. They had, as a nation, followed the swastika into the abyss. This was Stunde Null, 0 hour. The long, agonizing process of digging out, both from the rubble and from the lies, was about to begin.